Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. It is I, UrzaMaster. With me, as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby. Welcome, gentlemen, back to Starfleet Headquarters, Starfleet Academy, and the original series of Star Trek. Today's episode, we dive into Return to Tomorrow, which is an awesome title, which also doesn't quite fit this episode exactly, but there's a lot to talk about, and one of my favorite but not favorite actors in this episode, I think, is going to warrant a lot of discussion. Without further ado, I turn it over to Fert Derby for some great background on today's episode of Star Trek.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks, Trekkies, in the Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and any other quadrants that are lurking out there just beyond Federation space, accessible via wormhole or other intergalactic travel. We are indeed going to return to tomorrow, and then we would have to go all the way back to February 9th, 1968, when this episode first aired. We're bringing back director Ralph Senesky. We've covered Mr. Senesky's work here before. He's done some interesting Star Trek episodes. He may not be shooting them out like Mark Daniels or Joseph Pevney, our returning champions, but Mr. Senesky's first episode was This Side of Paradise, where everybody went hippie with the plants on that surveyed world. We talked about that on the Warp Core episode 40. He did Metamorphosis, when Kirk and the landing party had that multicolored jello-like blob that they encountered. We talked about that on Warp Core 48. And he also did Obsession, where Kirk was determined to kill the smoke monster. We talked about that on Warp Core 52. And you'll find episodes 40, 48, and 52 in the archives as we debated and discussed Mr. Selensky's previous credits. And I have to say, if you just took those as a random slice of Star Trek original series episodes, there are, like I say, some very interesting ones, some character-driven ones, some ones where special effects may not have necessarily been the driving engine, but some real humanity. And I believe that of the three, Obsession was a particularly high water mark for this Starfleet Tribunal. Our writer was John Dugan, and here's the thing. You actually saw him credited on screen as John Kingsbridge. And this is a rare case where we had back-to-back Star Trek episodes, including our previous episode that we covered in Warp Core 57, A Private Little War, which was also attributed to a pseudonym. So we had back-to-back pseudonyms, which is interesting. But there's no great, like, behind-the-scenes turmoil like we had with Don Engels and Gene Roddenberry for Private Little War. In fact, I'm not quite sure why John Kingsbridge was chosen for John Duggan, because I think John Kingsbridge is a fabulous name, and maybe that's all he was going for, was something flashy. Lifestyles of the rich and famous. Whatever name he was using, he did some TV work. He wrote for Bonanza. He wrote for One Atom 12. He wrote for the original Mission Impossible. He wrote for Columbo and Peter Falk and Little House on the Prairie. And I mean, come on, that's a pretty wide path he was carving in 60s and 70s television shows. He also received a Writers Guild of America nomination for Best Dramatic Episode for Return to Tomorrow. So they didn't end up bringing home the trophy, but he was acknowledged as one of the 5 best in 1968 for that category. So congratulations almost to John Duggan. As UrzaMaster alluded to in our opening, we also have the first appearance of actress Diana Muldaur. She will appear in this episode. We'll talk about her. She'll appear in the 3rd season in Is There in Truth No Beauty? And no spoilers on what we're going to say about that one when we get to the 3rd season of TOS. But she's probably best known, at least for us young'uns, as Dr. Katharine Pulaski, who popped in and out of the 2nd season of Star Trek The Next Generation, rocking 80s hair and exchanging pointed, barbed dialogue with the Enterprise D crew, including, I believe, its captain, Jean-Luc Picard. So we all remember Dr. Pulaski fondly, maybe not with that hair. But this was her first appearance as a Star Trek guest regular, if you will. And she finally found her niche in the late 80s. We also had a special bonus, guys. Sargon the Glowy Ball, which was featured in this episode, was voiced by none other than our favorite chief engineer, James Doohan. And he was the disembodied voice. Never got to see him in the flesh, although he did a passable William Shatner impersonation throughout. But that was James Doohan, lifted of that brogue, that deep Aberdeen brogue, and broadcasting from various bodies, and even the Enterprise itself at one point later in the show. So with that being said, exciting things. Chapel is back. We've been seeing a bit more of Christine lately. Sulu's back. They finally finished shooting that John Wayne picture, the Green Berets. And spoiler alert, there was more interest in his Star Trek career than that particular real-time Vietnam War drama, action, whatever the heck that was. It didn't land with audiences, but people were happy to see him back at the helm of NCC 1701. We have, once again, godlike beings, in a manner of speaking, trapped in glowy balls, aka orbs. But this one, I think, gentlemen, as we talked about Ralph Saminsky doing interesting work as a director, once again, we don't go for the trite, the trope, or the obvious here. And what we come off with is a fairly nuanced, fairly detailed, and fairly mature story of androids and consciousness and what makes somebody human versus non-human. We've seen droids, androids, robots, replicants portrayed throughout science fiction from the 1960s forward. I think this is the first time we've ever seen them greasy as they are preparing to transfer their consciousness into these bodies. I just got the sense that they were lathered up with Vicks VapoRub or some other substance. And if that's the future, count me out and get me a towel as far as that goes. But we also got to see some of our crew members, particularly Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner, once again embody a different personality and so forth. It's not really fair with a guest star like Diana Muldaur because we haven't really got a baseline to work from. But we definitely see what Shatner and Nimoy were up to. And gentlemen, I think that's where I kind of want to lead us is how did we feel some of the choices made by our performers, some of the freedoms as they were unshackled from having to portray ultra serious Vulcans or ultra heroic captains and the like. What did we think of two of the big three coming in basically being possessed for 2/3 of this episode?
I think it was really interesting to see Leonard Nimoy playing a devious, not quite evil necessarily, but certainly a devious, underhanded version of an alien that had not only a hidden agenda, but really no caring or feeling for these compatriots, if you will, that spanned all these millennia together. It was very interesting to see a long-standing vendetta painted out. It was somewhat unpredictable. I mean, it was set up in a way that it's odd, but you know, for the time, I'm sure it was far more shocking than it was to my eyes these days. But it really broke some new ground for Star Trek, which I feel like, as tropey as it can be, godlike being, you know, Enterprise in crisis, you know, pretty girl situation, like it's still compelling TV. And I know it was way new at the time, but even now, having watched a multitude of episodes of various Star Trek shows, this had my attention. And I can see why it was nominated for a Best Dramatic Episode, because it was pretty heavy-handed at times. I mean, it really kind of made you consider a lot of meta-type, philosophical questions. What would you do with eternal life? If you have this kind of power, would you be responsible with it, or would you impose it upon the world or the people around you? And, who's truly noble? Who has the noble cause? Because it could have easily gone any of three ways, and almost did. I find it very interesting. We get some Kirk speeches that are very William Shatner, but voiced by James Doohan, which tickles me pink. I think it's fantastic. We get Chapel in this episode in a way that it makes you really wish we got more of her throughout the series. I mean, you're starting to forget a little bit about Yeoman Rand because you're getting enough Nurse Chapel, and it's starting to be one of those things like I really wish Star Trek, the original series, had done more with, is sort of these tertiary characters that don't have to be in every episode, but could be recurring. And I think that inspired, of course, Next Gen and other shows to introduce those kinds of folks who are sort of transient, in and out type characters. I think most notably of which is Q. And I think original series was always driving at an entity like Q, with all these godlike beings we've encountered in just 2 short seasons so far. I really liked... I think my favorite part is I really liked that the entire time they're building these artificial bodies, Scotty's like, there's no way this is going to work. It's a bucket of bolts. And it really doesn't work. And that's the thing is, like, even though, like, the body is there and it's starting to form, like, it's not going to work, but not for the reasons, I think the audience is assuming Scotty is talking about. He may be speaking to this in a way that is not directly applied to the engineering or the mechanics. And that, I mean, it seems like not a super nuanced episode or not super deep, but it's pretty... I mean, it gets pretty into the weeds with some of the big questions. And I thought that was really cool because it does it without being, like, boring or dry. It's not David Attenborough. Love him to death. But, boy, if you're not buckled up for a documentary about penguins, I don't know what you're doing watching David Attenborough. But this will take you on a ride that's entertaining and fun and gives you these characters in new ways that you wouldn't have anticipated. And puts them in real, measurable danger. I had a very good time watching this episode.
Yeah, it's an episode that could have crashed and burned. I mean, it could have just turned into one of those burned, glowing balls towards the end of the episode that wound up getting melted. It could have been that, and instead, they pull it off. And I was afraid that the voices were going to be hokey and something I wasn't going to like, but they pull it off. I even felt like there was a kind of a cap. Yeah, they are godlike beings, but I felt there was a ceiling to them, which I hadn't really felt before when they've dealt with these types of beings, that they were all-powerful beings. Here I felt like there was something that made it a little more measurable in their advancement beyond. It looks like you want to add something there, Fert.
Well, yeah, no, I mean that's actually something. That's actually something that I thought that this episode successfully pulled off, whereas something like Who Mourns for Adonis or The Apple or something wasn't. Is that yes, there were limits, that were kind of placed on what they could or couldn't do, and I mean anytime. Regardless of when in the timeline you've been watching this, obviously if you watched it first in 1968, you wouldn't have these musings that I'm having. But when you can be reminded of Philip K. Dick and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which Ridley Scott ultimately transformed into Blade Runner, which Warner Brothers then transformed into a franchise, I mean you're in a good conversation when you're having that, and I think that's one of the reasons that I was pointing out Ralph Sineski, is that I feel like whether it was just blind luck when he was picked to direct these episodes, This Side of Paradise and Metamorphosis and Obsession and all that, I just feel like he brings a thoughtfulness behind the camera to episodes that, as you say, could walk the tightrope between corny, campy, a jumbled mess, and goodness knows season 2 has had a couple of those. But there's a thoughtfulness there that I think is emblematic of great Star Trek, and I think that's exactly what this episode aspires to be, is to get you to sit there and not just consider whether, Kirk's going to save the day, or Leonard Nimoy, Spock's going to come up with a scientific solution, or Bones is going to grouse about the transporter. Like, this is really what the show was built to do. And when it's done well, I mean, like I say, it has few peers in terms of that space of being able to merge drama, science fiction with the human experience, and so forth. So, like you say, I think
even the trickery at the end, right, where Spock actually goes into Chapel's body, and that's how they trick. Like, that was, it wasn't so over the top like Kirk talking a supposedly all-knowing machine and making it not compute and blow up and things like that.
Yeah.
That's where we start, and maybe if that happens once or twice, I get it, but it was like we keep saying, right, that's a trope. And here, again, they keep it in more of a believable range, or an acceptable range, that it's believable. And I think that's another thing that kind of sells this episode, or makes it happen. Because, again, I was very fearful at the beginning. Very fearful of where it was going to go. All that overacting by Kirk. I mean, we were really seeing a lot of Shatner going on there with what he was, the way he was going. Sulu gets the con. Like, he gets the bridge again. And I'm still trying to figure out this chain of command on this ship. Poor Scotty. Like, but they're, I think they're still kind of, like any series, I guess, they're trying to figure out the way it's supposed to go, and eventually maybe they would have settled into a little bit more of a rhythm, in a sense, or an understanding of that chain of command of who should step in there, because it should have been Scotty. He was on the ship. Like, I didn't figure that one out.
It's whoever is in Shatner's line of sight as he's leaving the bridge.
Yes.
You've got the guy.
Kirk's like, I pick you. So, yeah, just make an ensign sit there for all he cares. I like, again, we see some more of the Spock and Rand relationship, kind of advance, which I don't know how, and maybe it's just because I was younger, I didn't see some of these episodes, and I keep giving all this credit to the Strange New World people, but I guess I didn't see these episodes where I actually knew that they kind of had these feelings for each other. So to be able to see that happening again just kind of reinforces our Strange New World love, I guess. So, again, I was really surprised. I thought I was going to hate this episode, and I wound up really enjoying it. Very surprised.
Well, I think it would be short-sighted of us not to talk about the implications this episode has on Next Generation. Because you've got these prospective android bodies that they're building that would last 1,000 years. And then you get Data, who ostensibly lives forever in, Picard. Except he doesn't, of course. But, what does this really, when we talk about, because I think this is a foundational episode in a lot of ways, what do you guys think about how this episode sets the idea of android bodies up for, future series like Picard? Lest we forget, Picard himself becomes an android before the end.
Yeah, and even the idea of seeding, that was something else I wrote down from the Next Gen episode about the idea that there's a species out there that was seeding the universe, and they bring that up in this episode too. And I wrote down, it sounds like seeding from Next Gen. And I think that's important what you're bringing up. So I know I'm going in two directions with this, but too bad. The androids, like, how could they never get it right, in a sense? Like, Data was the only one that it only seemed to work. And I could never, maybe again, that kind of technology or what they were doing was in its infancy when it worked with Data. But but here we are seeing it all the way back, you know, in this episode. So I think that's a good point. And then this idea of seeding, which they kind of move forward with, which I don't think did they ever clarify that Next Gen beyond that one episode? They kind of kept
did.
messing with that.
They
Okay.
did. They established the race that it was, and there was that culminating episode where was it the Klingons, the Romulans, and the Federation that all showed up? Or
Yes.
I don't think the Vulcans were there,
No.
but they basically established that there was this supreme race that had traveled all over and seeded their DNA in fragments in all these primitive planets. But there was never really a line that drew them back to this
Yeah.
calamity. They're more of this peaceful race. So I don't think they ever actually like solidified an exact tie to this episode, but I think the implication is that it's possible. But I don't know if the Star Trek books or the comics have ever really explained that. It'd be interesting to know, and if you all out there, Warp Core fans, know the answer, drop us a comment and let us know. I know the comic books have answered a lot of questions, like what happened to the Cisco, and suffice to say it wasn't baseball, Jake! So that's my best Cisco, and it's probably never going to get any better. But yeah, I think it's so cool seeing these episodes and having seen Next Gen, Picard, and a lot of these other series that there is so much intertwined. It's not just Strange New Worlds, which is drawing, of course, heavily on source material, but it's really everything. And that's partly, of course, Roddenberry was still alive for Next Gen, but I think it just goes to show that this series really did lay the bricks upon all of what Star Trek became later, in all the best ways. And in saying so, I think we should kick off our Warp Core ratings for Return to Tomorrow. And Dr. Katharine Pulaski, or whatever her name is in this episode, she'll always be Dr. Pulaski to me. Fert Derby, lay it on us. How many Warp Cores are you giving this episode?
Well, friends, I am inching close to that threshold of pure Star Trek bliss, and maybe it's because we've had such an up and down roller coaster, Space Mountain, Incredicoaster kind of season, where the good has been really good and the bad has been not so good. I don't think it quite merits a 7, but I'm willing to get right up there. I'm willing to go 6.5 on this, because for all the reasons that we've discussed, for the possibilities that this android technology might have inspired Data's creator. I mean, could have been part of the Enterprise's logs, and then later, we can do exciting fan fiction behind the scenes of what really happened. But it's possible. Scotty was exposed to it and so forth. The Federation may have known. Like, you can't rule it out. So that was another exciting connection that UrzaMaster just seeded in our consciousness. But to have a smiling, smirking Spock playing a villain that is not, I want to take over the Alpha Quadrant and conquer Earth and the Klingons under my heel, but just wanted to live. I mean, and can you deny that, amongst any of us, really? I mean, so he was a baddie, and he was doing bad things, but he might not have necessarily been the stock cardboard, one-dimensional villain of the piece. And I think by resisting those impulses and giving it more shades and nuance and texture, I think that's why this episode brushes against greatness. It will certainly be in the running for when we talk about our favorite and least favorite episodes of Season 2 in a few weeks. Right here on the Warp Core, you aren't going to want to miss it, friends. You've come with us this far. You've got to see where we land. But I believe that Return to Tomorrow is definitely going to draw some votes and some attention. So I'm going 6.5, friends.
I'm gonna go 6. I was not expecting that going into this episode at all. I was going to go somewhere else with this. Again, this is just a good... I feel like this is a good sci-fi episode, just overall. And I think I said that about the previous episode too, but this is just good science fiction, right? And I think that's important too. Trek or not Trek, just some great fiction that's going on there. And it's kind of to Fert Derby's point. Nimoy, I think, is really underrated as an actor. I can't believe he didn't do more. Now, admittedly, I don't know his entire acting career. I know he was so worried about being typecast, obviously, as Spock, and then he was okay with it afterwards. But I really think people missed out on casting this guy in different things because though I think and I'm just pulling this out of nowhere, so go with it. I think the idea of him being unemotional, maybe that scared him in terms of acting, where really he had multiple times in Star Trek that he was showing off different forms of emotion, thus different ways he could have acted in movies or TV or anything like that. Because I think besides Star Trek, he only had bit pieces here and there, except for the Body Snatchers,
Invasion
maybe.
of the Body
I don't
Snatchers.
really know anything beyond
1978.
Yeah. Yeah, there we go. So, and that's another reason I'll give it 6 out of 7. Just for Nimoy and his acting, he pulled it off. Very underrated.
Can you imagine the reverse, if you made Shatner be unemotional, as opposed to...
He couldn't do it.
He wouldn't have been able to do it.
No, I can't. I'm not even going to go there. It won't happen.
No. I shudder to think. I really do. I'm going to go 6.5 as well. And for the same reason Lord Uther went 6. I think Nimoy showing off his range as an actor here, surprisingly, really shines. In anything I've ever seen Leonard Nimoy in where he isn't Spock, I have to say I'm a little disappointed that he's not Spock. Other than, of course, his music career. The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins is a masterpiece that every child should learn in school. But I gotta say, this whole Star Trek thing, Spock has so many opportunities to show off ranges of emotion that I think, we tend to forget, like, Vulcans are deeply emotional. Despite the fact that they have no emotions, they really end up in emotional situations all the time. And so I was enthralled by what I saw, and I think I've spoke my piece on the rest of it, but this is one of those episodes that if somebody asked me, what's an off-the-beaten-path episode of Star Trek that just absolutely needs to be watched? Something that somebody wouldn't think about right away. This would probably be up there, top 3, if not number 1. So with that, our warp cores have been raided, our dilithium crystals have been rejuvenated, and we carry forward to galaxies far, far away. And to discover new old episodes of Star Trek in new ways, perhaps. Until then, live long and prosper.